Margaret sat in her spacious home office, staring at the bank statement that showed 8 figures. At 72, she had built an empire from nothing, turning a small flower shop into a chain of luxury garden centers across 3 states. The morning sun filtered through her floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the mahogany desk, where she had made countless business decisions that had shaped not just her fortune, but the futures of everyone she loved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Today was different, though. Today, she was planning the biggest surprise of her life. For months, Margaret had been quietly working with her financial advisor and attorney to restructure her assets. Her son Daniel, now 45, had been struggling with his construction business ever since the economic downturn hit their region. His wife Sarah had lost her teaching job, and their 2 teenage daughters were approaching college age. Margaret had watched from the sidelines as her son's pride prevented him from asking for help, even as she could see the stress lines deepening around his eyes during their weekly family dinners. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret would transfer ownership of 2 of her most profitable garden centers to Daniel, along with a substantial cash infusion to modernize his construction company. She had already spoken to her accountant about the tax implications and her lawyer about the legal paperwork. Everything was ready. She just needed to present it to Daniel in a way that wouldn't wound his masculine pride. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Daniel's number, her heart racing with anticipation. She had raised him to be independent and strong, values that sometimes made it difficult for him to accept help, even from family. But surely, she thought, when he understood that this wasn't charity but a business partnership, he would see the wisdom in it. "Hey, Mom," Daniel's voice came through, sounding tired and distracted. "Daniel, sweetheart, are you free for lunch today? I have something important I want to discuss with you." There was a pause. Margaret could hear machinery running in the background and the voices of workers. "Actually, Mom, I'm swamped today. We're behind on the Morrison project, and I've got 3 other jobs that need my attention. Can we talk later?" Margaret felt a small pang of disappointment but pushed it aside. "Of course, dear. How about dinner then? I could cook your favorite pot roast." "Mom, I appreciate it, but Sarah's making dinner tonight and the girls have homework. Maybe this weekend?" The weekend came and went without the conversation Margaret had been hoping for. Daniel was busy with work. Sarah was dealing with a family crisis involving her elderly mother, and the teenagers were absorbed in their social lives. Margaret tried calling again on Monday, but Daniel was out of town on a job site. Tuesday, he was meeting with suppliers. Wednesday, his phone went straight to voicemail. By Thursday, Margaret's excitement had transformed into a gnawing anxiety. She decided to take matters into her own hands and drove to the construction site, where Daniel was working. She found him bent over blueprints, his hard hat askew, deep in conversation with his foreman about material delays. "Daniel," she called out, waving from beside her silver Mercedes. He looked up, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then he said something to his foreman and walked over, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "This is a construction site. It's not safe for you to be wandering around." Margaret felt her enthusiasm deflate slightly at his tone, but she pressed on. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. I've been trying to reach you all week." Daniel sighed and glanced back at his crew. "Mom, I'm in the middle of a work day. Whatever it is, can it wait until I get home?" "Daniel, this could change everything for you and your family. I have a proposal that—" "Mom." His voice carried a sharp edge that Margaret had never heard before. "I need you to mind your own business. I'm handling things just fine on my own. I don't need you swooping in here disrupting my workday because you've got some idea in your head." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Mind your own business. After everything she had sacrificed, Everything she had built, everything she had planned to give him. He was telling her to mind her own business. "But Daniel, if you would just listen—" "No, Mom. I'm 45 years old. I run my own company. I take care of my own family. I don't need my mother showing up at my job site like I'm still 12 years old." His voice rose slightly, and Margaret noticed some of his workers glancing over. "I need you to respect my boundaries and let me handle my own affairs." Margaret stood there in her designer coat, feeling suddenly very old and very foolish. The papers in her purse, the ones that would have made Daniel a millionaire, felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. "I was only trying to help," she said quietly. "I know, Mom, and I appreciate that you care. But I need you to understand that I've got this handled. Now, I really need to get back to work." With that, he turned and walked back to his crew, leaving Margaret standing alone beside her car, the roar of machinery drowning out the sound of her heart breaking. The drive home was a blur of confused emotions. Margaret had spent her entire adult life building something meaningful, something that could benefit the people she loved most. The rejection stung, but it was the dismissive tone that truly wounded her. Mind your own business. As if her love and concern for her son was somehow inappropriate, somehow intrusive. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, surrounded by the financial documents she had so carefully prepared. The gift that would have secured Daniel's future, his children's educations, his wife's peace of mind, suddenly felt like evidence of her own foolishness. Had she been overstepping? Was her desire to help really just another form of control? She poured herself a glass of wine and tried to push the day's events from her mind, but Daniel's words kept echoing. Mind your own business. The irony wasn't lost on her that her business was exactly what had enabled her to offer him this opportunity in the first place. Margaret had started with nothing. Born to parents who cleaned office buildings at night to make ends meet, she had learned early that security came from hard work and smart decisions. When she married Daniel's father, Robert, at 22, she had dreams of building something together. Robert was charming and ambitious, with big plans and bigger promises. For the first few years of their marriage, Margaret worked 2 jobs while Robert chased one failed venture after another. When Daniel was born, Margaret made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She used the small inheritance from her grandmother to buy a failing flower shop in their town's shopping district. Robert was skeptical, even mocking. "What? Do you know about running a business?" he had laughed. "You can barely keep our houseplants alive." But Margaret had a vision. She saw how the wealthy women in town drove to the next city over to buy quality flowers and plants. She studied their preferences, learned about exotic species, and slowly transformed the little shop into something special. She worked 18-hour days, often with baby Daniel strapped to her chest in a carrier, learning everything she could about horticulture, business management, and customer service. The first year was brutal. There were days when Margaret wondered if Robert had been right, if she was foolish to think she could build something meaningful. But slowly, customers began to notice the difference. Her flowers lasted longer, her arrangements were more creative, and her advice about gardening actually worked. Word spread. By the time Daniel was 5, Margaret had paid off the initial loan and was looking at a second location. Robert, who had initially dismissed her efforts, suddenly became very interested in the business. He wanted to be listed as co-owner, wanted access to the accounts, wanted a say in major decisions. Margaret, still hopeful about their marriage, agreed to make him a partner. It was a decision she would regret for years. Robert's involvement brought chaos to the carefully organized systems Margaret had developed. He made impulsive purchases, promised customers things they couldn't deliver, and spent money on equipment they didn't need. Worse, he began treating Margaret's employees poorly, undermining her authority and creating a hostile work environment. The breaking point came when Margaret discovered that Robert had been siphoning money from the business accounts to fund another one of his get-rich-quick schemes. When she confronted him, he became defensive, then angry. "This is as much my business as yours," he had shouted. "I'm your husband. We're supposed to be partners." But Margaret had learned to read financial statements, and the numbers told a clear story. Robert was dragging down everything she had built. The divorce was ugly and expensive, but Margaret fought for what she had created. In the end, she retained full ownership of the business, though Robert got half of their other assets, including the house. At 31, Margaret found herself a single mother with a thriving business and a determination never to let anyone else control her financial destiny. She rented a small apartment for herself and Daniel, pouring every extra dollar back into expanding the business. Daniel, now 9, adapted to their new reality with the resilience that children often possess. He spent afternoons at the flower shop, doing homework in the back office while Margaret worked. Those were some of the happiest years of Margaret's life. She and Daniel developed a close bond, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. He helped with simple tasks around the shop, learned the names of different flowers, and even developed his own theories about which arrangements looked best together. Margaret treasured those conversations, the way his young mind approached problems with such creative solutions. When Daniel expressed interest in building things, Margaret encouraged him. When he wanted to take shop class instead of advanced literature, she supported his choice. When he announced at 17 that he wanted to study construction management instead of business, Margaret had been thrilled. She wanted him to follow his passion, not feel obligated to continue her work. Build something amazing, she had told him at his high school graduation. Build something that lasts. And he had. Daniel's construction company, started when he was 28, had built a solid reputation for quality work and fair pricing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He married Sarah, a lovely woman who taught 3rd grade and shared his values of hard work and family loyalty. When their daughters were born, Margaret had been over the moon. She was finally a grandmother, and she threw herself into the role with enthusiasm. For years, their relationship had been strong. Daniel would bring the girls to visit the garden centers, teaching them about plants the way Margaret had once taught him. Sarah would call for advice about everything from canning vegetables to handling difficult students. Margaret felt useful, valued, and deeply connected to the family she had worked so hard to provide for. But something had shifted in recent years. Daniel became more distant, more formal in their interactions. When Margaret offered to pay for the girls' private school tuition, he declined politely but firmly. When she suggested family vacations that she would finance, he thanked her, but said they preferred to stay local. When she tried to give them expensive gifts for birthdays and holidays, Sarah would quietly return them, saying they were too generous. At first, Margaret had attributed this to Daniel's natural independence, the same quality she had instilled in him as a child. But gradually, she began to sense something else. There was a tension in family gatherings, a way that conversations stopped when she entered rooms, a feeling that she was being tolerated rather than welcomed. The realization hurt more than Margaret wanted to admit. She had spent decades building wealth not for its own sake, but because she wanted to be able to provide security and opportunities for the people she loved. What was the point of having money if she couldn't share it with her family? That's what had driven her to develop the plan she had tried to discuss with Daniel. It wasn't charity. It was succession planning. It was ensuring that the empire she had built would continue to benefit her family long after she was gone. The garden centers weren't just businesses to her. They were her legacy, her life's work made tangible. Now, sitting in her study with the rejected gift plans scattered across her desk, Margaret felt a profound sense of isolation. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Mind your own business. But her family was her business. Her love for them was the foundation everything else was built on. She reached for her phone, thinking she might call her sister Linda, who lived across the country. Linda had never married, never had children, and had often told Margaret she was lucky to have Daniel and his family. But as Margaret held the phone, she hesitated. What would she say? That her successful, independent son had told her to mind her own business when she tried to give him millions of dollars? It sounded absurd even to her. Instead, Margaret found herself scrolling through her contacts, looking at all the people who worked for her, who depended on her business decisions, who treated her with respect and deference. In boardrooms and business meetings, her opinion mattered. Her insights were valued. Her experience was considered wisdom. But in her own family, she was apparently just an interfering old woman who needed to mind her own business. The thought sparked something in Margaret that had been dormant for too long. If Daniel wanted her to mind her own business, then perhaps it was time she did exactly that. Perhaps it was time to remember that her business was worth minding. The next morning, Margaret called her attorney, James Morrison, and scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. James had been handling her legal affairs for over 20 years, had seen her through the divorce, the business expansions, and countless other major decisions. He was one of the few people who truly understood the scope of what she had built. "Margaret," James greeted her warmly when she arrived at his office. "I was surprised to get your call. I thought we had finished all the paperwork for the asset transfer to Daniel." Margaret settled into the leather chair across from his desk, her posture straight and her expression determined. "We need to discuss some changes to those plans, James." "Changes?" He pulled out her file, thick with documents and amendments, accumulated over the years. "What kind of changes?" "I want to revoke the transfer entirely. I want to restructure my will, my trusts, everything." James paused, his pen hovering over his legal pad. "Margaret, this is a significant decision. Just last week you were excited about surprising Daniel with this gift. What's happened?" Margaret chose her words carefully. "My son has made it clear that he doesn't want my involvement in his affairs. He's told me, in no uncertain terms, to mind my own business. So I've decided to take his advice." "I see." James had known Margaret long enough to recognize when she had made up her mind about something. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to establish a charitable foundation. I want my assets to go towards scholarships for single mothers trying to start businesses. I want to fund programs that teach financial literacy to women leaving difficult marriages. I want to create something that will help people the way I wish someone had helped me when I was starting out." James nodded slowly, making notes. "And Daniel?" "Daniel is a successful businessman who has made it clear he doesn't need or want my help, so he won't be receiving it." "Margaret, I have to ask, are you making this decision out of hurt feelings? Because family disputes can often be resolved, and making permanent changes to estate planning in the heat of emotion." "James," Margaret interrupted, her voice steady and calm, "I've had 40 years to observe my son's character. This isn't about hurt feelings. This is about accepting reality. Daniel wants to be independent, and I'm going to honor that wish completely." Over the next 2 hours, they worked through the details. Margaret's estate, worth approximately $12 million, would be restructured entirely. The garden centers would be sold upon her death, with proceeds going to the foundation. Her personal assets would fund the initial operations. A small inheritance would go to her granddaughters for their education, but it would be held in trust and administered by the foundation, not by Daniel. "What about your personal effects?" James asked. "Family photos, heirlooms, that sort of thing?" Margaret considered this. "The girls can have whatever they want of sentimental value. As for the rest, let the foundation sell what has value and donate what doesn't." As she signed the preliminary documents, Margaret felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. For so many years, her financial planning had been driven by the question of what would happen to Daniel and his family after she was gone. Now, for the first time since she had started building her wealth, She was planning for something beyond her immediate family. That evening, Margaret called her financial advisor, Patricia Chen, and scheduled a meeting for the following week. If she was going to restructure her entire estate, she wanted to make sure she did it in the most effective way possible. "I want to establish a foundation that will outlast me," Margaret explained to Patricia over lunch at their usual restaurant. "Something that will continue helping people long after I'm gone." Patricia, who had been managing Margaret's investments for 15 years, listened carefully as Margaret outlined her vision. "This is quite a departure from what we've been planning," she said finally. "Are you sure this is what you want?" "I'm absolutely certain," Margaret replied. "I've spent my entire life building wealth with the assumption that it would benefit my family. But my family has made it clear they don't want my involvement in their financial affairs. So I'm going to redirect that energy toward people who do want help." "What triggered this change, if you don't mind me asking?" Margaret set down her coffee cup, choosing her words carefully. "I offered to help my son with his business, and he told me to mind my own business. It made me realize that perhaps I've been so focused on him that I've forgotten about all the other people I could be helping." Patricia nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Margaret, in all the years I've known you, I've watched you make incredibly smart business decisions. You've always been able to see opportunities that others miss. Maybe this is just another example of that." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this isn't about Daniel rejecting you. Maybe this is about you recognizing that your impact could be much broader than just one family. Think about how many single mothers you could help start businesses. Think about how many women you could help escape bad situations by teaching them financial independence." The idea resonated with Margaret in a way she hadn't expected. She had always been proud of what she had accomplished, but she had never really considered the broader implications of her success. She had started with nothing and built something extraordinary. That story, those skills, that knowledge, it could benefit so many people beyond her immediate family. "I want to start immediately," Margaret told Patricia. "I don't want to wait until I'm gone to begin this work. I want to be involved, to see the impact it has." They spent the rest of the meeting discussing the practical aspects of establishing a foundation while Margaret was still alive. It would require restructuring her assets, setting up new legal entities, and developing programs and partnerships with existing organizations. It was a massive undertaking, but Margaret felt energized by the challenge in a way she hadn't in years. Over the following weeks, Margaret threw herself into the project with the same intensity she had once brought to building her business empire. She met with lawyers, accountants, social workers, and business development specialists. She visited programs that helped women start small businesses, spoke with counselors who worked with people leaving abusive relationships, and researched the most effective models for charitable giving. The more she learned, the more passionate she became about the project. There were so many women struggling with the same challenges she had faced decades earlier, trying to build something from nothing, trying to provide security for their children, trying to break free from situations that limited their potential. Margaret decided to call her foundation Seeds of Independence, reflecting both her background in the garden industry and her belief that financial independence was the key to personal freedom. The logo would be a small plant breaking through, concrete, symbolizing growth in challenging circumstances. During this period, Margaret saw very little of Daniel and his family. He called occasionally, brief conversations about weather and work, but there was a distance that hadn't existed before. Margaret didn't try to bridge it. If Daniel wanted space, she would give him space. She did, however, maintain her relationship with her granddaughters, Emma and Sophie. Now 16 and 14, they were old enough to have their own relationships with her that didn't require their parents' mediation. Margaret took them to lunch individually, helped them with college preparation, and listened to their concerns about the future. It was during one of these lunches with Emma that Margaret first got a glimpse of how her changed priorities were being perceived by Daniel's family. "Grandma, Emma said carefully, cutting her sandwich into precise pieces. Dad says you've been acting weird lately. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Weird how? He says you've been meeting with lawyers a lot, and that you're planning to give away all your money to strangers instead of family. The characterization stung, but Margaret kept her expression neutral. What do you think about that? Emma shrugged. I think it's your money. You earned it. You should be able to do whatever you want with it. And what does your father think I should do with it? I don't know. He and Mom have been having a lot of quiet conversations lately. The kind where they stop talking when Sophie and I come into the room. Margaret felt a pang of concern. Are they worried about money? I think so. Dad's been working a lot lately, staying out really late, and Mom's been looking at job postings online. She keeps saying she might go back to teaching. This was exactly what Margaret had been trying to prevent with her original plan. Daniel was struggling, but his pride was preventing him from accepting help, and now the whole family was suffering for it. Part of Margaret wanted to call him immediately, to force him to listen to her offer, to make him understand that she could solve all their problems with one conversation. But Daniel's words echoed in her mind. Mind your own business. He had been clear about what he wanted from her, and Margaret was determined to respect those boundaries. Grandma, Emma said, her voice smaller now. Are you mad at us? Margaret reached across the table and took her granddaughter's hand. Oh, sweetheart, no. I'm not mad at you or Sophie or your mother. I love you all very much. But you're mad at Dad. Margaret considered how to answer that honestly without burdening Emma with adult problems. I'm not mad at your father. I'm just trying to respect his wishes about how he wants to handle his life. But you're still going to give all your money away? I'm going to use my money to help people who need help and want help. That might include you and Sophie for college, but it probably won't include your parents. Emma nodded slowly. Dad said you've always been stubborn. Margaret couldn't help but smile at that. Your father would know. That evening, Margaret sat in her study, looking over the preliminary plans for the foundation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Daniel was struggling financially, desperately needing exactly the kind of help she was planning to give to strangers. But his pride had created a barrier that she couldn't cross without violating the boundaries he had established. She wondered if this was how her own parents had felt when she had struggled as a young single mother. They had occasionally offered small amounts of help, which Margaret had politely but firmly declined. She had been determined to make it on her own, to prove that she could build something without depending on anyone else. Now she was watching her son make the same choice, and she was finally understanding the frustration her parents must have felt. It was agonizing to have the resources to solve someone's problems and be unable to use them because of pride and independence. But there was a difference, Margaret realized. Her parents had respected her wishes and stepped back. They had trusted her to figure things out on her own, even when it meant watching her struggle. Maybe that's what real love looked like. Not the desperate need to fix everything, but the wisdom to know when to let go. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. Margaret had spent so many years feeling responsible for Daniel's well-being, first as his mother, and then as someone with the resources to help him. Letting go of that responsibility felt like letting go of part of her identity. But maybe that was exactly what she needed to do. Maybe it was time to stop defining herself primarily as Daniel's mother and start thinking of herself as Margaret, the entrepreneur, Margaret the philanthropist, Margaret the woman who had built something extraordinary and was now ready to share it with the world. The more she thought about it, the more excited she became about the possibilities. Instead of waiting for Daniel to accept her help, she could be actively helping dozens of other people right now. Instead of focusing all her energy on one family that didn't want her involvement, she could spread that energy across a much wider network of people who would welcome her support. Margaret opened her laptop and began drafting the mission statement for Seeds of Independence. As she wrote, she felt the same sense of purpose and possibility that had driven her in the early days of building her business. She was embarking on something new, something meaningful, something that would define the next chapter of her life. And if Daniel wanted to mind his own business, well, she was about to make helping other people her business. She had a feeling it was going to be the most rewarding work she had ever done. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the conference room of her flagship garden center, addressing a room full of women who had come to hear about the Seeds of Independence program. The foundation was now operational, and the first cohort of participants was preparing to graduate from the intensive business development course she had created. "When I started my business 47 years ago," Margaret told the group, "I had no mentor, no business plan, and no safety net. I had to learn everything through trial and error, and it nearly broke me more than once. You don't have to take that path. We're here to give you the tools, the knowledge, and the support that I wish I had when I was in your position." The women in the room came from all walks of life. There was Carmen, a recently divorced mother of 3 who wanted to start a catering business. Janet, who had left an abusive marriage and was learning to restore furniture. Maria, whose husband had died unexpectedly, leaving her with 2 young children and a dream of opening a daycare center. Each had a story of determination, of refusing to be defined by circumstances beyond their control. As Margaret spoke, she felt a sense of fulfillment that had been missing from her life for years. These women looked at her with respect and gratitude, not as an interfering matriarch, but as someone whose wisdom and resources could change their lives. After the presentation, Carmen approached Margaret with tears in her eyes. "Ms. Henderson, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. My children and I have been living in my sister's basement since the divorce, and I was starting to think I'd never be able to provide for them on my own." Margaret placed a gentle hand on Carmen's shoulder. "You already have everything you need inside you. We're just helping you organize it and put it to work." It was true. The foundation didn't give handouts. It provided education, mentorship, and small business loans with favorable terms. Participants had to complete a rigorous course in business fundamentals, develop comprehensive business plans, and demonstrate their commitment to success. Margaret had designed the program to create genuine independence, not dependency. As Margaret drove home that evening, her phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had accompanied their interactions ever since their confrontation at the construction site. "Hello, Daniel," she answered. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice was strained, formal. "Can you come over for dinner tonight?" Margaret glanced at the clock. It was already 6:30, and she had planned to spend the evening reviewing applications for the next foundation cohort. "Is everything all right?" "Just come over, Mom, please." The please in his voice was what convinced her. Daniel rarely asked for anything, and he almost never said please. Margaret turned her car toward his neighborhood, wondering what could have prompted this sudden invitation. When she arrived at Daniel's house, she immediately noticed signs of stress. The lawn, usually meticulously maintained, was overgrown. Sarah's flower beds, typically bursting with color, looked neglected. Even more concerning, Daniel's work truck wasn't in the driveway, though his personal car was. Sarah answered the door, her smile brittle and forced. "Margaret, thank you for coming. The girls are at their friend's house tonight, so it's just the 3 of us." Margaret followed Sarah into the living room, where Daniel sat hunched forward on the couch, his hands clasped tightly together. He looked up when she entered, and Margaret was shocked by his appearance. He had lost weight. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Daniel, you look terrible. Are you sick?" He let out a humorless laugh. "In a way, I guess I am." He gestured for her to sit down. "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." Margaret settled into the armchair across from him, her heart beginning to race. "I'm listening." "The business is failing." The words came out in a rush, as if he had been holding them back for too long. I lost the Morrison contract 3 months ago when I couldn't deliver on time. The suppliers have put me on cash only. Terms because I'm behind on payments. I've had to let go of half my crew. Margaret felt a stab of pain in her chest. This was exactly what she had been trying to prevent with her original offer. Daniel, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you always think money can solve everything, he snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Sarah reached over and placed her hand on Daniel's arm. What Daniel is trying to say is that we've been trying to handle this on our own. He took out a second mortgage on the house to keep the business afloat, but it wasn't enough. Margaret's eyes widened. You mortgaged the house? Daniel, that's incredibly risky. You think I don't know that? Daniel's voice rose. Then he took a deep breath and continued more quietly. Mom, we're going to lose everything. The house, the business, maybe even our marriage if this stress keeps up. The last part hit Margaret like a physical blow. Daniel and Sarah had always seemed solid, united. If this crisis was threatening their relationship, things were worse than she had imagined. How can I help? Margaret asked quietly. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a long look. Finally, Sarah spoke. We were hoping you might consider giving us a loan. Not a gift, a loan. We'll pay you back with interest. How much do you need? $200,000, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret tried to keep her expression neutral, but inside, she was reeling. $200,000 was exactly what she had been prepared to give Daniel 6 months ago, along with the business transfer. If he had just listened to her then, none of this would have happened. Daniel, she said carefully, 6 months ago, I tried to talk to you about your business. I had a plan that would have prevented all of this. I know. He buried his face in his hands. Sarah told me what you were probably going to offer. I was an idiot, Mom. I was so focused on proving I could handle everything myself that I didn't even listen to what you were trying to tell me. You told me to mind my own business. I know, and I was wrong. I let my pride get in the way of common sense, and now my family is paying the price for it. Margaret looked at her son, seeing him truly vulnerable for the first time since he was a child. Part of her wanted to write the check immediately, to fix his problems the way she had always fixed things when he was young, but something held her back. Daniel, where was this humility 6 months ago when I could have helped you avoid this crisis? His head snapped up, and for a moment she saw a flash of the old defensiveness. Are you saying you won't help us? I'm saying that your attitude toward my involvement in your life has been very clear. You didn't want my help when you didn't need it desperately. Why should I believe you want it now, rather than just needing it? Sarah leaned forward, her voice tight with emotion. Margaret, I understand you're hurt. Daniel was rude to you, and he knows it. But this isn't just about him anymore. Emma and Sophie could lose their home. I might have to pull them out of their school. The mention of her granddaughters made Margaret's resolve waver. Emma and Sophie hadn't done anything wrong. They shouldn't suffer because of their father's pride. I need some time to think about this, Margaret said finally. Daniel's face fell. Mom, we don't have time. The bank is starting foreclosure proceedings next week. Then you should have thought about that before you told me to mind my own business, Margaret said, standing up. I'll call you tomorrow with my decision. The drive home was agonizing. Margaret's mind raced between anger, sympathy, and a deep sadness about how their relationship had deteriorated. Daniel had rejected her help when it was offered freely, out of love and generosity. Now he was asking for it desperately, as a last resort. The next morning, Margaret called James Morrison and asked him to meet her for lunch. She needed perspective from someone who understood both the legal and emotional complexities of family financial arrangements. So let me understand this correctly, James said after Margaret had explained the situation. 6 months ago, you were prepared to give Daniel substantially more than what he's asking for now, and he rejected it. Now he wants you to bail him out of a crisis that your original gift would have prevented. That's right. And you're conflicted about whether to help him. Margaret sighed. James, he's my son. I don't want to see him lose everything. But I also can't shake the feeling that helping him now would just reinforce the idea that he can dismiss me when things are going well and come running back when he needs something. James nodded thoughtfully. In my experience, family loans rarely work out well. There's always an imbalance of power, and it often breeds resentment on both sides. What would you do? I'd consider a different approach entirely. Instead of giving Daniel the money directly, what if you purchased his business debt and restructured it on terms he could actually meet? Margaret raised an eyebrow. Explain. You buy out his creditors, essentially becoming his primary lender. You set up a payment plan that's realistic given his current cash flow, and you take a security interest in the business. If he succeeds, he pays you back. If he fails, you own a construction company. The idea had merit, but it felt cold and businesslike for a family relationship. Wouldn't that make me his boss? In a way, yes, but it would also give you oversight to ensure that your investment is protected, and it would require Daniel to prove his commitment to making the business work. Margaret spent the rest of the day considering James's suggestion. The more she thought about it, the more it appealed to her. It would help Daniel without simply rewarding his past behavior. It would also give her a way to ensure that her money was being used responsibly. That evening, she called Daniel and asked him to meet her at her office the next morning. When he arrived, accompanied by Sarah, Margaret could see the hope and desperation in their faces. I've been thinking about your request, Margaret began, and I have a proposal. Daniel leaned forward eagerly. What kind of proposal? I'm willing to help you, but not with a loan. I want to buy your business debt and become your primary creditor. The hope in Daniel's eyes flickered. What does that mean? Margaret pulled out a folder that James had prepared. It means I pay off everyone you owe money to, and you owe that money to me instead. I'll restructure the payments so they're manageable, but there will be conditions. What conditions? First, you'll provide me with monthly financial statements for the business. Second, any major expenditures over $5,000 require my approval. Third, you'll attend quarterly meetings with my financial advisor to review your progress. Daniel's face had gone pale. Mom, you're talking about taking control of my business. I'm talking about protecting my investment. Daniel, you've proven that you can't manage the financial side of your business effectively. If you want my help, you have to accept my oversight. Sarah spoke up for the first time since they'd arrived. What happens if we can't pay you back? Then I become the owner of the business, and Daniel becomes my employee. The room fell silent. Margaret could see Daniel struggling with his pride, weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. And if I say no to these terms? Then you handle your problems without my involvement, just like you wanted 6 months ago. Daniel stood up abruptly and began pacing. This isn't help, Mom. This is a takeover. You're using our desperation to get control of something I've built. Margaret felt a surge of anger. Something you've built? Daniel, you're about to lose everything you've built because you refuse to listen to advice or accept help. I'm offering you a way to save your business and your home, but I'm not going to do it by throwing money at a problem you created and hoping for the best. So this is punishment. This is reality. You told me to mind my own business. Well, if I'm going to invest $200,000 in your business, it becomes my business too. Sarah placed her hand on Daniel's arm. Daniel, maybe we should consider this. It's better than losing everything. But Daniel shook his head. No, I won't become my mother's employee. I'd rather lose the business than give up my independence. Margaret stared at her son, seeing the same stubborn pride that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. Then I guess we don't have anything more to discuss. Daniel headed toward the door, then turned back. You know what, Mom? You're right. This is your business now. Congratulations on finally getting what you always wanted. Complete control. With that, he left, Sarah hurrying after him with an apologetic look over her shoulder. Margaret sat alone in her office, feeling hollow and drained. She had offered Daniel a lifeline, and he had rejected it because it came with strings attached. She couldn't decide if she felt vindicated or devastated. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma. Grandma, Dad came home really upset. Did you guys have a fight? Margaret stared at the message for a long time before responding. We had a disagreement about business. Sometimes adults have to make difficult decisions. Emma's response came quickly. Are you going to help us? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Margaret realized that Emma probably knew about their financial troubles, despite her parents' efforts to shield her. The teenager was old enough to understand that her grandmother had the power to solve their problems, but was choosing not to. It's complicated, sweetheart, Margaret texted back. Everything with grown-ups is complicated, Emma replied. I just want to know if we're going to have to move. Margaret set the phone down and walked to her window, looking out at the garden center that had started it all. In a few hours, she would be meeting with the newest group of foundation applicants, women who were fighting for the chance to build something of their own. They would look at her with gratitude and respect, hanging on every word of advice she offered. Meanwhile, her own son was driving home to tell his daughters that they might lose their house because their grandmother had chosen to attach conditions to her help. The irony was bitter. Margaret had spent months learning to redirect her maternal instincts towards strangers who appreciated her guidance. Now her own family was suffering because she couldn't find a way to help them that preserved both her financial interests and Daniel's dignity. That evening, Margaret called Linda, her sister in California. They had maintained a close relationship despite the distance, and Linda had always been a good sounding board for difficult decisions. So let me get this straight, Linda said after Margaret had explained the situation. Daniel rejected your help when he didn't need it, then came crawling back when he was desperate, and now he's rejected your help again because it comes with oversight? That's about the size of it. And you're second-guessing yourself because of the grandchildren. Exactly. Linda was quiet for a moment. Margaret, do you remember when you were going through your divorce and Mom and Dad offered to let you and Daniel move back in with them? Margaret did remember. Her parents had made the offer out of genuine concern, but it had come with conditions. She would have to follow their rules, help with household expenses, and accept their input on how she raised Daniel. I turned them down, Margaret said, slowly. You turned them down because you knew that accepting would have meant giving up your independence. You chose to struggle on your own rather than accept help that came with strings attached. This is different. Daniel's not a young mother trying to build a life. He's a middle-aged man who's made poor business decisions. Is it different, or are you just seeing this from the other side now? Margaret felt a chill of recognition. Are you saying I should just give him the money with no conditions? I'm saying you should think about what you really want to accomplish here. Do you want to save Daniel's business, or do you want to teach him a lesson? The question haunted Margaret for the rest of the evening. What did she want to accomplish? When she had first conceived the plan to help Daniel, it had been motivated purely by love and generosity. Now, her feelings were tangled up with hurt, frustration, and a desire to prove a point. The next morning brought a call from Sarah. Her voice was strained but polite. Margaret, I wanted to thank you for trying to help yesterday. I know Daniel didn't handle it well. Sarah, I'm sorry things went the way they did. I truly want to help, but I need to protect my interests too. I understand. And honestly, you're probably right about needing oversight. Daniel is a wonderful man, but he's not great with money management. Margaret felt a glimmer of hope. Is there a way we can work this out? Sarah sighed. I don't know. Daniel feels like accepting your terms would be admitting that he's a failure as a businessman and a provider. His father left when he was 9, and he's always been terrified of not being able to take care of his family. The mention of Daniel's childhood fears gave Margaret pause. She had worked so hard to show Daniel that he could depend on her, that she would always be there to support him. But maybe in doing so, she had inadvertently made him feel like he needed to prove his independence from her. Sarah, what if we modified the terms? What if Daniel maintained operational control of the business, but I had approval rights only for major financial decisions? That might be more palatable to him. But Margaret, I have to ask, why is this so important to you? Why not just give us the loan we asked for? Margaret considered the question carefully. Because I love you all too much to enable Daniel's poor decision-making. If I just give him money every time he gets in trouble, what does that teach Emma and Sophie about responsibility and consequences? I hadn't thought about it that way. Sarah, I've spent my whole life building something meaningful, and I want to pass on more than just money to my family. I want to pass on the values and skills that created that money in the first place. There was a long pause. Let me talk to Daniel. Maybe I can help him see this differently. After hanging up, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic. Sarah had always been the more pragmatic of the two, and if anyone could help Daniel overcome his pride, it would be her. But 3 days passed without a call back. Margaret continued with her foundation work, meeting with new applicants and visiting with current participants. The contrast between the gratitude of these women and the resistance of her own family was becoming increasingly stark. On Friday afternoon, Margaret received an unexpected visitor at the garden center. Emma appeared at her office door, looking upset and determined. Grandma, we need to talk. Margaret immediately stood up and guided Emma to the comfortable seating area in the corner of her office. What's wrong, sweetheart? Everything. Emma's voice was tight with emotion. Mom and Dad have been fighting constantly. Sophie's been crying herself to sleep every night, and I heard Mom on the phone with a realtor yesterday. Margaret's heart sank. Oh, Emma. Grandma, I don't understand what's happening. Dad says you won't help us, but Mom says you offered to help and he said no. Who's telling the truth? Margaret took a deep breath, trying to figure out how to explain a complex adult situation to a 16-year-old. We're both telling the truth in a way. I offered to help, but with conditions that your father felt were unacceptable. What kind of conditions? I wanted to have some say in how the business is run, to make sure my investment was protected. Emma looked confused. That seems reasonable. If someone loaned me money for something important, I'd expect them to want to make sure I used it responsibly. Out of the mouths of babes, Margaret thought. Your father sees it differently. He feels like it would take away his independence. But if he loses the business anyway, won't that take away his independence too? Margaret marveled at her granddaughter's clear thinking. That's exactly right. Emma was quiet for a moment, then looked up with tears in her eyes. Grandma, I love my dad, but I think his pride is more important to him than our family's security. Is that wrong of me to think? Margaret pulled Emma into a hug, her heart breaking for all of them. It's not wrong, sweetheart. Sometimes adults make decisions that seem illogical, especially when their emotions are involved. Can you fix this? I don't know. I can't force your father to accept help he doesn't want. Emma pulled back from the hug. What if I talk to him? Oh, honey, this isn't your responsibility. You shouldn't have to be in the middle of this. But I am in the middle of it whether I want to be or not. Sophie and I are the ones who are going to lose our home and have to change schools. Don't we get a say in this? Margaret realized that Emma was right. The decisions being made by the adults would affect the children most of all, yet they had no voice in the process. What would you say to your father? I'd tell him that being a good provider means accepting help when your family needs it, not letting pride destroy everything you've worked for. Margaret was amazed by her granddaughter's maturity. That's very wise, Emma. Will you give me another chance to fix this? Will you make the offer one more time if I can get Dad to listen? Margaret hesitated. She had already put herself in a vulnerable position twice, only to be rejected both times. But looking at Emma's hopeful face, she couldn't bring herself to refuse. If your father is willing to sit down and have a rational conversation about this, I'll consider it. Emma brightened immediately. Thank you, Grandma. I'll talk to him tonight. After Emma left, Margaret sat in her office wondering if she was setting herself up for more disappointment. But she had to admit that Emma's perspective had given her hope. Maybe there was still a way to help her family while protecting her own interests. That evening, Margaret's phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and she answered with cautious optimism. Mom, Emma says you're willing to discuss this again. I'm willing to listen if you're willing to approach this differently than last time. There was a pause. I've been thinking about what you said, about protecting your investment. And I've been looking at our situation realistically. Sarah's right. I'm not good with the financial side of the business. Margaret felt a surge of hope. Does that mean you're willing to consider my terms? I'm willing to negotiate. Maybe we can find a middle ground that works for both of us. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was progress. For the first time in months, Margaret felt like they might be able to work together instead of against each other. When would you like to meet? She asked. How about tomorrow morning? Sarah and I will come to your office and we'll try to work something out. I'll see you then. As Margaret hung up the phone, she felt cautiously optimistic. Maybe Emma's intervention had been exactly what they needed to break through the impasse. Maybe her family could still be saved, even if it required compromise from everyone involved. The next morning would bring either reconciliation or final defeat. Margaret could only hope that love would prove stronger than pride, and that her son would finally understand that accepting help wasn't the same as admitting failure. She spent the evening reviewing her foundation files, drawing strength from the stories of women who had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles through determination, and the willingness to accept support from others. If they could do it, maybe Daniel could too. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching Margaret's uncertain mood as she prepared for what could be her final attempt to help her son. She dressed carefully in her navy business suit, the one that had carried her through countless important negotiations over the years. If this was going to be a business discussion, she would approach it with the same professionalism that had built her empire. Daniel and Sarah arrived at Margaret's office precisely at 10 o'clock. Margaret noted that Daniel looked better than he had a few days earlier. His shirt was pressed, his hair combed, and some of the desperate edge had left his eyes. Sarah carried a leather portfolio, suggesting they had come prepared with documentation. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us again, Sarah began as they settled into the conference area of Margaret's office. We've spent a lot of time talking, and we think we have a proposal that might work for everyone. Margaret raised an eyebrow. This was unexpected. She had anticipated coming into negotiations from a position of strength, but it seemed Daniel and Sarah had done their homework. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, I owe you an apology. Emma helped me understand that my pride was putting my family at risk, and that's not the kind of man or father I want to be. I appreciate that, Daniel. But I also need you to understand something. When I told you to mind your own business, it wasn't because I don't value your opinion or your help. It was because I felt like you were treating me like a child instead of a business partner. Margaret felt a stab of recognition. How so? Sarah opened the portfolio and pulled out several documents. We've been doing some research on family, business partnerships, and we found some models that might work better for both of you. Daniel leaned forward. Instead of you buying my debt and becoming my creditor, what if we restructure this as a genuine partnership? You invest in the business in exchange for a 40% ownership stake. I maintain operational control, but major financial decisions require both our signatures. Margaret studied the papers Sarah had laid out. They were surprisingly thorough. Incorporation documents for a new business entity, partnership agreements, even projected financial statements for the next 5 years. You've put a lot of thought into this, Margaret observed. We had help, Sarah admitted. I reached out to my cousin who's a business attorney. She helped us understand the difference between a bailout and an investment. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he continued. Mom, I realize now that when you originally tried to talk to me, you were thinking like a businesswoman, not just like a mother. You saw an opportunity to expand your portfolio while helping family. I should have listened. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in this entire ordeal, Daniel was speaking to her as an equal, not as a child seeking help or a man defending his territory. What would this partnership look like day to day? She asked. I run the construction operations. You handle the financial planning and business development. We meet monthly to review progress and make strategic decisions together. Sarah added, and the business would benefit from your connections and reputation in the community. Daniel's always been good at the construction side, but he's never been comfortable with the networking and relationship building that drives business growth. Margaret found herself genuinely intrigued by the proposal. It wasn't what she had originally envisioned, but it was far more sophisticated than the simple bailout Daniel had initially requested. What about the immediate crisis? The foreclosure proceedings? Daniel's expression grew serious. That's where we need your help most urgently. We need you to provide the initial capital injection, $200,000 to settle the debts, and establish working capital. In return, you get your 40% stake, and we both sign personal guarantees that protect your investment. Personal guarantees? Sarah nodded. If the business fails, we're both personally liable for your cow investment. Daniel would forfeit his share of the house equity to you, and I would co-sign the agreement. Margaret sat back in her chair, impressed despite herself. This wasn't the desperate plea she had expected. It was a genuine business proposal with real protections for her investment and clear consequences for failure. I need to ask you something, Daniel, and I want an honest answer. Are you proposing this because you genuinely see the value in partnering with me? Or because it's the only way you can get the money you need? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see him wrestling with the question. Finally, he spoke. 6 months ago, it would have been just about the money. But these past few months of struggling on my own have taught me something. I'm good at building things, but I'm not good at building a business. You are. And I think together, we could create something bigger than either of us could manage alone. What changed your mind? Honestly? Emma did. She asked me why I was willing to lose everything we'd worked for rather than accept help from someone who loves us and wants to see us succeed. I didn't have a good answer for that. Sarah reached into the portfolio again and pulled out another document. We also want to show you this. It's a business plan for expanding the construction company into commercial development. Daniel has always wanted to move beyond residential work, but he's never had the capital or connections to make it happen. Margaret reviewed the plan, noting the careful market research and realistic financial projections. This wasn't a desperate scramble to save a failing business. It was a roadmap for growth and expansion. You want to develop commercial properties? Daniel's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. There's a huge demand for small-scale commercial development in our area. Restaurants, medical offices, retail spaces. The big developers aren't interested in projects under $2 million. but that's exactly the market we could serve. And you think we could be competitive in that space? I know we could. I've been watching the market for years, building relationships with architects and subcontractors. I just never had the financial backing to take on larger projects. Margaret found herself caught up in Daniel's vision. This was the first time in years that she had seen him truly excited about his work, not just grinding through the daily challenges of running a small business. "What would you need from me beyond the initial investment?" Sarah answered, "Your business connections, your experience with complex financial planning, and your reputation in the community. Daniel's built a good name for quality work, but he doesn't have the kind of established relationships that open doors to bigger opportunities." Margaret realized that this proposal would give her something she had been missing: a genuine role in building something new, not just maintaining what she had already created. The foundation work was fulfilling, but it was essentially giving away the wealth she had accumulated. This would be actively creating new value. "I want to counter-propose something," Margaret said finally. "Instead of a 40-60 split, let's make it 50-50. Equal partners, equal responsibility, equal reward." Daniel looked stunned. "Mom, you're putting up all the initial capital. That doesn't seem fair." "Daniel, you're putting up years of industry experience, established relationships, and your reputation. That has value too. If we're going to be partners, let's be real partners." Sarah smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "Are you saying yes?" Margaret stood up and extended her hand to Daniel. "I'm saying yes to exploring this partnership. But I want to bring my attorney and accountant into the process to make sure we structure this properly." Daniel stood and shook her hand, and Margaret was surprised by the firmness of his grip and the steadiness of his gaze. This wasn't the desperate man who had pleaded for a loan a few days earlier. This was a businessman proposing a mutually beneficial arrangement. "There's one more thing," Daniel said. "I want to include a clause that either of us can buy out the other's share if the partnership isn't working. I don't want family dynamics to destroy a good business relationship." Margaret nodded approvingly. "That's smart thinking." As they worked through the details over the following hour, Margaret felt a growing sense of excitement. This wasn't the outcome she had envisioned when she first tried to help Daniel, but it was potentially much better. Instead of rescuing him from his mistakes, she would be partnering with him to build something new. "When do you want to start?" Margaret asked as they prepared to leave. "As soon as the paperwork is finalized," Daniel replied. "I've already identified 3 potential projects we could bid on if we have the capital to back them up." After Daniel and Sarah left, Margaret sat alone in her office, processing what had just happened. In less than 2 hours, her relationship with her son had been completely transformed. They were no longer mother and child, creditor and debtor, or even just family members with complicated dynamics. They were business partners. Margaret called James Morrison and scheduled a meeting for the next day to begin structuring the partnership agreement. Then she called Patricia Chen to discuss the financial implications of the investment. Both advisors were cautiously optimistic about the arrangement, though they insisted on due diligence and proper legal protections. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret threw herself into the partnership planning with the same intensity she had once brought to building her garden center empire. She reviewed Daniel's financial records, visited his current job sites, and met with his key employees and subcontractors. What she found impressed her. Daniel's reputation for quality work was genuine. His employees were loyal and skilled. His subcontractor relationships were strong. The business had failed not because of poor workmanship or bad management, but because Daniel had expanded too quickly without adequate capital reserves. It was exactly the kind of problem that could be solved with proper financial planning and oversight. Margaret also began leveraging her business connections to explore opportunities for the new partnership. She arranged introductions with commercial real estate developers, bank lending officers, and city planning officials. Within days, She had identified potential projects worth over $5 million in total development costs. "I can't believe the doors you can open," Daniel told her after a particularly productive meeting with a developer who was looking for a contractor to build a small medical plaza. "I've been trying to get a meeting with this guy for 2 years. It's not magic, Daniel. It's just relationships built over time. In a few years, you'll have the same kind of network." The partnership was officially finalized 3 weeks after their initial meeting. Margaret's investment immediately stabilized Daniel's finances, allowing him to settle his debts and establish proper operating capital. More importantly, it freed him from the constant stress of financial crisis, allowing him to focus on what he did best. The change in Daniel was remarkable. The weight of financial pressure had been crushing his natural optimism and creativity. Now, with adequate capital and Margaret's business expertise behind him, he approached projects with renewed energy and ambition. Their first major project together was a small office complex for a group of healthcare professionals. Margaret handled the financing, permitting, and client relations, while Daniel managed the construction operations. The project came in on time and under budget, earning them a reputation for reliability that led to 3 more contracts within months. But the real test of their partnership came 6 months later, when they bid on their largest project yet, AI, mixed-use development that would include retail space, offices, and residential units. The project required a $2 million line of credit and would take 18 months to complete. "Are you sure we're ready for something this big?" Daniel asked as they reviewed the bid specifications. Margaret studied the financial projections. "The numbers work, and we have the team to handle it. But it's your call. You're the one who'll be managing the day-to-day operations." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. 6 months ago, I would have said no. Too risky, too much pressure. But working with you has taught me something about calculated risks versus desperate gambles. What's the difference? Desperate gambles are what you do when you're out of options. Calculated risks are what you do when you have solid planning, adequate resources, and a clear understanding of what could go wrong. Margaret smiled. "That might be the most sophisticated business analysis I've ever heard you make." "I had a good teacher." They won the bid for the mixed-use development, beating out 2 larger competitors by proposing a more innovative design and a faster construction timeline. Margaret's financial backing allowed them to offer competitive pricing, while Daniel's reputation for quality work gave the client confidence in their ability to deliver. The project was challenging but successful. Margaret found herself energized by the complexity of managing multiple subcontractors, coordinating with city planners, and solving the inevitable problems that arose during construction. She had forgotten how much she enjoyed the daily challenges of building something tangible. Daniel flourished in his role as project manager, demonstrating leadership skills that Margaret had never seen him develop. He handled problems with calm competence, motivated his crew through difficult phases, and maintained quality standards even under pressure. When the project was completed, Margaret and Daniel stood together looking at the finished building, both feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. "You know what the best part of this is?" Daniel said. "It's not just that we built something together. It's that we built something better than either of us could have built alone." Margaret nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The building represented more than just their business success. It represented a relationship rebuilt on mutual respect and shared goals. As their partnership matured, Margaret began to see a different side of Daniel's character. Away from the financial stress that had dominated his life for years, he revealed himself to be thoughtful, strategic, and genuinely innovative in his approach to construction challenges. Margaret realized that her early attempts to help him had been based on seeing him as he was in crisis, not as he could be with proper support. The success of their partnership also had unexpected effects on the rest of the family. Emma and Sophie, no longer worried about losing their home, threw themselves into their studies with renewed focus. Sarah, relieved of financial stress, returned to teaching part-time and seemed happier than Margaret had seen her in years. More importantly, the family dinners that had become tense and awkward resumed their former warmth. With the business relationship clearly defined and successful, Margaret and Daniel could interact as family members without the undercurrent of financial dependence or wounded pride. "I want to tell you something," Daniel said to Margaret after a particularly successful family gathering. "When I told you to mind your own business, I was wrong about more than just the business stuff. I was wrong about what family means." "What do you mean?" "I thought independence meant not needing anyone else. But working with you has taught me that real independence means being strong enough to accept help when it makes sense, and being valuable enough to offer help when others need it." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "That might be the wisest thing you've ever said. I learned it from watching you with your foundation work. You're not helping those women because you need to feel important or because you want to control them. You're helping them because you have skills and resources that can make their lives better, and they have dreams and determination that inspire you." Margaret realized that Daniel had understood something about her foundation work that she hadn't fully articulated to herself. The relationship between mentor and mentee was indeed reciprocal. She gave knowledge and resources, but received purpose and inspiration in return. As the second year of their partnership progressed, Margaret began to think about succession planning in a new way. Instead of worrying about what would happen to her wealth after she was gone, she was actively involved in training Daniel to manage and grow that wealth. The partnership had become a living laboratory for teaching business skills and financial management. More importantly, Emma and Sophie were watching the partnership closely, learning lessons about collaboration, mutual respect, and the difference between dependence and interdependence. Margaret realized that she was modeling for her granddaughters a different way of thinking about family relationships and financial responsibility. The foundation work continued to flourish as well, but Margaret found that her partnership with Daniel had enhanced her effectiveness as a mentor. She better understood the challenges of balancing family relationships with business decisions, and she could offer more nuanced advice to the women in her programs. One afternoon, as Margaret reviewed applications for the Foundation's third cohort, she came across a letter that stopped her cold. It was from a woman named Jennifer, whose husband had told her to mind her own business when she had tried to give input on his failing restaurant. Margaret called Jennifer immediately and scheduled a meeting. When they sat down together, Margaret saw something of her former self in the younger woman's frustrated determination. "My husband keeps making the same mistakes over and over," Jennifer explained. "He won't listen to suggestions, won't accept help, and won't admit that he doesn't know everything about running a business. I have a background in marketing, but every time I try to offer ideas, he tells me I don't understand the restaurant industry." Margaret leaned back in her chair, thinking about her own journey from rejected advisor to valued partner. "Jennifer, what if I told you that sometimes the best way to help someone is to stop trying to help them? I don't understand. When someone tells you to mind your own business, maybe the answer is to make helping other people your business. Build your own success, your own network, your own expertise. Sometimes people need to see what they're missing before they're ready to accept it." Margaret told Jennifer about her foundation work, about the partnership with Daniel, and about the long journey from hurt rejection to mutual respect. By the end of their conversation, Jennifer had a completely different perspective on her situation. "So you're saying I should focus on my own goals instead of trying to fix his problems? I'm saying you should build something so valuable that he'll want to be part of it, rather than begging him to let you be part of something that's failing." Jennifer enrolled in the Foundation's program and, within a year, had started her own marketing consulting firm specializing in restaurant promotion. Her husband's business continued to struggle while hers thrived. Eventually, he approached her about forming a partnership to combine his restaurant management skills with her marketing expertise. Margaret watched Jennifer's transformation with deep satisfaction, recognizing the parallels to her own story. Sometimes the best way to help family was to show them what real success looked like, rather than trying to rescue them from their failures. As Margaret approached her 75th birthday, she reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken. The foundation had helped over 200 women start successful businesses. The partnership with Daniel had grown into a multi-million-dollar construction and development company. Emma was preparing to study business in college, inspired by watching her grandmother and father work together. Most importantly, Margaret had learned that family relationships were like any other kind of partnership. They worked best when built on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and shared goals rather than obligation, guilt, or unconditional support. The morning of her birthday, Margaret arrived at the office to find Daniel waiting for her with a gift box and a serious expression. "I have something for you," he said, "but it's not exactly a birthday present." Margaret opened the box to find a beautifully framed architectural drawing of a building she didn't recognize. "What is this?" "It's the Henderson Center for Women's Business Development. I've been working with an architect for months to design a permanent home for your foundation. The building would include classrooms, office space for new businesses, a resource library, and meeting rooms for networking events." Margaret stared at the drawing, speechless. Daniel continued, "I want to build it for you, not as a favor or a gift, but as a business investment. I think we could create something that would generate income through rent from established businesses while providing affordable space for startups." "Daniel, this would cost millions to build." "I know. That's why I'm proposing we take the company public. Use the IPO proceeds to fund this project and expand into other markets." Margaret looked up from the drawing to see Daniel watching her with the same excited expression he had worn as a child when presenting her with a hand-drawn picture. "You want to take our company public?" "I want to build something that will outlast both of us, something that will keep helping people long after we're gone." Margaret realized that Daniel had learned the most important lesson she could have taught him, that true wealth wasn't about accumulating money, but about creating value that benefited others. "When do we start?" she asked. Daniel grinned. "I thought you'd never ask." As they began planning for the next phase of their partnership, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. Daniel's angry words about minding her own business had initially felt like rejection and dismissal, but they had ultimately led her to discover her true business, not just making money, but using that money to create opportunities for others. The foundation had given her purpose beyond profit. The partnership with Daniel had given her a collaborator instead of a dependent. And the success of both ventures had given her something she had never expected to find in her 70s, a sense that her most important work was still ahead of her. That evening, at the family birthday dinner, Margaret looked around the table at faces that reflected contentment, ambition, and genuine affection. Emma and Sophie were discussing their college plans with excitement rather than anxiety. Sarah was talking about her ideas for expanding the foundation's educational programs. Daniel was sketching building designs on his napkin while describing his vision for sustainable construction practices. "Grandma," Emma said, interrupting Margaret's thoughts, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When Dad told you to mind your own business, were you mad?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "At first, yes. I was hurt and angry. But eventually, I realized he was giving me exactly the advice I needed." "What do you mean?" "He was telling me to focus on my own goals and my own values, instead of trying to control other people's decisions. That's how I discovered the foundation work, and how we eventually became business partners." Sophie, who had been listening, quietly spoke up. "So sometimes when people reject your help, they're actually helping you?" Margaret smiled at her younger granddaughter's insight. "Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is someone forcing you to find your own path, instead of following theirs." As the evening wound down and family members began to leave, Daniel lingered behind to help with cleanup. Mom, he said as they carried dishes to the kitchen, I need to tell you something. That day when I told you to mind your own business, I wasn't just talking about the business. I was telling you to mind your own life instead of trying to live mine for me. Margaret paused in her dishwashing. I know, and you were right. But I was also wrong. I should have said that I wanted you to mind your own business so that we could eventually mind our business together. Margaret turned to face her son, seeing in his expression the same determination that had driven her to build her first successful venture all those years ago. Daniel, I think we minded our business very well indeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.